What if I told you King George III, the monarch who ruled an empire spanning continents, harbored secret obsessions so dark they could have shattered the very image of the crown? For centuries, courtiers whispered in fear, servants trembled behind locked doors, and historians buried fragments of a reality too scandalous for the public eye. Yet now, forgotten letters, hidden diaries, and palace inventories reveal a chilling truth. One that exposes the Mad King's hidden rituals, his strange desires, and the psychological terror he inflicted on those closest to him. Behind the gilded walls of Windsor and Kew, masks hung silently, chains glimmered in dim candlelight, and every corridor seemed to watch. Servants moved like shadows, trapped between obedience and dread. The king's pleasures were not simple indulgences. They were exercises of power, obsession, and control, twisting fear and desire into a single, inescapable ritual. Tonight, we descend into the private chambers they never dared to show. You will see the objects, the ceremonies, the human cost of a monarch whose mind blurred pleasure and punishment. You will hear the whispers, the muffled cries, and the echoes of a palace alive with secrets. This is a story of darkness, lust, and power. A story historians tried to erase, but that we now uncover for the first time. Stay with me, because what you are about to witness is the hidden life of a king whose madness reached far beyond his throne. A secret world that reveals the darkest corners of human obsession. The palace seemed alive with a tension that no visitor could name. Courtiers whispered in shadowed corners, their voices barely audible over the creak of the grand oak floors. Even during the brightest hours of the day, there was a sense that the walls themselves were listening, storing secrets too dark to ever escape. King George III moved through his throne room with a measured, almost unsettling calm, but his eyes betrayed a mind that danced dangerously close to obsession. Servants spoke in hushed tones about his peculiar habits, the way he lingered over certain objects, the manner in which he studied his attendants, as if he were both a master and a predator in the same glance. No one dared to linger too long in his presence, and the slightest misstep, a faltered smile, or a prolonged glance could bring about silent retribution. Behind the gilded panels of the palace, corridors led to chambers rarely entered and even more rarely discussed. Velvet curtains concealed what the eye was not meant to see, and the faint metallic scent of something unspoken hung in the air. Rumors circulated of objects that were both instruments of fascination and instruments of terror. Chains, masks, and items that seemed innocuous until touched, until observed in the flickering candlelight. Even the most seasoned advisors walked with caution, aware that curiosity could cost them far more than reputation. In this world of shadow desire, knowledge itself became a danger. The king's presence transformed ordinary rooms into spaces charged with an invisible energy. Candles flickered as though responding to his moods. Shadows stretched longer in hallways as he passed, and every mirror seemed to hold a distorted reflection of not just the body, but the mind. Servants claimed that at night, faint laughter or whispers of incantations could be heard from the rooms above, so soft and eerie that even the bravest froze in place, unsure whether they were hearing truth or the echoes of imagination. Yet these murmurs were only a prelude to what awaited those who were chosen to enter the inner sanctums of his secret world. Fear in the palace was a silent, living thing, and it moved like a pulse between the walls. Every gesture, every glance was weighted with tension. Courtiers learned to obey without question, to smile without enthusiasm, to stand without drawing attention. But the tension also carried fascination. Even in terror, there was a pull, a desire to understand the hidden depths of the king's mind, the compulsions and obsessions that shaped not just his nights, but the very heartbeat of the court itself. And so, the whispers continued, the shadows lengthened, and the story of the Mad King's private world began to emerge, piece by terrifying piece, each more unnerving than the last. Beyond the gilded halls and polished floors, secret staircases spiraled downward into darkness, leading to chambers that the eyes of the world were never meant to witness. The doors were heavy, carved from dark oak and reinforced with iron, their hinges whispering complaints at each opening. Few had ever crossed their threshold, and those who had often returned pale. their memories shrouded in terror and fascination. Within these hidden rooms, the air carried a strange, intoxicating mix of incense, wax, and a metallic tang that hinted at acts both intimate and cruel. Every object seemed chosen with precision, each one a tool for the king's obsession, each one a fragment of his hidden psyche. Candles lined the walls, their flames trembling as if they sensed the tension that saturated the space. Chains hung from hooks, glinting under the low light, alongside masks that seemed to stare back with silent accusation. Furniture was arranged not for comfort, but for observation and control, each chair and table positioned to impose order and power. Velvet drapes concealed corners where shadows pooled like ink, and mirrors angled just so reflected figures in ways that distorted reality, elongating limbs, twisting expressions, making the ordinary appear grotesque. Every glance, every movement within these chambers became a test, a silent challenge issued by the unseen king. Servants whispered of rooms that changed with the king's whims. A cabinet that once held mundane objects might later be repurposed into an instrument of ritual. Carpets, heavy with the scent of oils, could conceal more than footsteps, secrets, traces of ceremonies, and objects meant to confound the mind. Even the faintest disturbance, a misplaced candle or a misaligned chair, could be noticed, remembered, and subtly punished. The hidden chambers were alive with the king's presence, infused with his obsession, echoing with the memory of acts performed in the dark. Yet these rooms were not merely spaces of fear. They were stages for a dark theater, where the king exercised both desire and control. Mirrors reflected the unwitting participants, transforming them into actors in a performance they could not refuse. Shadows elongated, flickered, and danced across the walls, as if conscious of the power that shaped them. The rooms themselves became instruments, amplifying every sound, every movement, every whispered plea. And in this carefully constructed world, the king observed, learned, and orchestrated, a master of hidden desires, his compulsions hidden behind layers of wood, iron, and shadow. Even centuries later, the very air in these chambers seems to retain the memory of what occurred within. Historians piecing together the fragments of his life describe objects and spaces that defy simple explanation. Each artifact hinting at rituals, obsessions, and a mind unrestrained by conventional morality. Walking through the descriptions of these hidden rooms is to feel the pulse of a palace alive with secrecy, to sense the lingering echo of a monarch whose obsessions shaped not just rooms, but the very fabric of those who served him. King George III's obsessions were not confined to secret chambers or hidden objects. They extended like invisible threads into every corner of the palace. Every gesture, every glance, every whispered word became a tool for control. Servants learned quickly that obedience was survival. A hesitated step, a faltered bow, or the faintest flicker of curiosity could draw his piercing gaze, and set in motion a psychological torment no one dared describe aloud. He measured loyalty and fear with equal precision, molding his court into instruments of his desires. In his mind, pleasure and power were inseparable, and the boundaries between them blurred until neither could exist without the other. The king's presence transformed ordinary spaces into stages of subtle manipulation. A table meant for conversation could be a test of courage. A simple curtain could conceal a scene of silent observation. Mirrors, chains, and masks were not merely objects. They were extensions of his will, designed to assert dominance and record compliance. Those who entered his private world felt the invisible weight of scrutiny, as if the walls themselves were watching. No corner was exempt, no whisper unnoticed, no shadow left unexamined. Even routine tasks were laden with tension. A cup of tea placed slightly askew, or a candle burning too low, could provoke an unnerving response that lingered long after the encounter ended. Yet, his control was not always overt. Often it took the form of suggestion, subtle direction, or the gentle pressure of expectation. He observed and tested, experimenting with fear and fascination in equal measure. Servants became participants in a psychological theater, where every action, however small, contributed to a grander design they scarcely understood. The king's obsession demanded more than obedience. It demanded immersion, Those who served him became entwined in his world, their minds touched by the same compulsions that guided his own. Rumors of these manipulations traveled in hushed tones through the corridors. Courtiers whispered of servants returning from the hidden chambers, pale, trembling, haunted by encounters they could not fully explain. Some spoke of being made to act out fantasies, of being observed under the careful orchestration of his gaze, and of moments where pleasure and terror were so entangled that neither could be distinguished. Fear, curiosity, and a strange fascination became constant companions to all who moved within his sphere. This obsessive control extended beyond the palace itself, influencing decisions, alliances, and even the perception of loyalty. The Mad King's private compulsions intertwined with his public rule, creating an invisible web that ensnared all who drew near. His obsessions were not mere indulgences. They were instruments of power, shaping minds and actions in ways that no historian could easily trace. Within these calculated confines, the king's world existed as a dark ecosystem of dominance, desire, and dread, each element reinforcing the other in an endless cycle of obsession. Nightfall transformed the palace into a place of silent dread. Candles flickered across high ceilings, casting shadows that seemed to twist and move on their own. In the corridors, the faint creak of floorboards carried farther than it should, as if the walls themselves were listening. Servants scurried past in muted panic, their breath shallow, eyes darting toward doors that led to rooms no one dared enter. Even the most seasoned courtiers felt a chill settle into their bones, as though the night had a mind of its own, a consciousness shaped by the Mad King's hidden obsessions. The whispers began then, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Voices that seemed to float from behind locked doors, echoing in the grand chambers. Some claimed they were fragments of incantations. Others believed them to be laughter, twisted into agony. Few dared investigate, for curiosity was met with swift and unseen reprisal. Yet the whispers pulled at the imagination, teasing the mind with glimpses of a world layered beneath the palace's polished surface, a world dominated by secrecy, control, and desire. Within the hidden chambers, the faint glow of candles revealed fleeting glimpses of objects that made the heart race and the mind reel. Masks stared with hollow eyes, ropes glimmered in the low light, and mirrors reflected not just faces, but shadows of acts too intimate and terrifying to describe aloud. Servants who had glimpsed these rooms spoke of sensations rather than events, the weight of unseen eyes, the almost tangible tension, and the feeling of being part of a performance orchestrated by a mind that knew no restraint. Fear and fascination were inseparable companions, entwined in a rhythm dictated entirely by the king's obsession. Even the grand halls, empty in the dead of night, carried the echoes of these hidden acts. A footstep could sound like a warning. A faint shuffle could feel like an accusation. Shadows pooled in corners and lengthened unnaturally, as if trying to flee the presence that had shaped them. Outside, the wind whispered through the palace gardens, rustling leaves in cadence with the pulse of tension within. It was a palace alive with secrecy, each night a rehearsal of dread and anticipation, each whisper a reminder that the Mad King's obsessions were never far away. And yet, despite the terror, there was a perverse allure. The unknown, the forbidden, the hidden, all drew attention like a moth to flame. Those who lingered, whether by chance or by duty, felt a magnetic pull towards the very spaces that terrified them. They felt the pulse of a mind untethered, a king whose compulsions created an ecosystem of fear, fascination, and unspoken desire. By the time dawn broke, the whispers faded, the shadows retreated, and the palace returned to its polished facade. Yet the memory of the night remained, indelibly etched into every corner, every floorboard, and every mind that had borne witness. Beneath the glittering grandeur of the palace, hidden staircases spiraled downward into shadows where the light of day dared not linger. Their wood groaned with age, each step a low, warning creak that seemed to echo for eternity. Few knew of their existence, and fewer still had the courage to descend them. The staircases led to corridors narrow and winding, walls lined with dark paneling that absorbed every whisper, every tremor of fear. It was a threshold to a world deliberately obscured, a liminal space between the familiar luxury of royal life and the king's private obsessions. The air grew heavier with each step. The faint tang of metal, incense, and wax mingled in a heady mix that set the nerves on edge. Candles mounted in iron sconces flickered, their flames distorted by the twisting corridors. Shadows lengthened and writhed as though alive, shifting unnaturally with each movement. Every corner suggested unseen eyes. Every doorway promised secrets the world was never meant to know. The staircases themselves were instruments, guiding those who dared downward into the king's carefully orchestrated labyrinth of desire, control, and psychological torment. Along the walls, strange carvings hinted at rituals long forgotten, symbols whose meanings were layered in secrecy and menace. Hooks and brackets, otherwise innocuous, were arranged with precision, ready to hold chains, ropes, or garments in a manner that transformed the architecture itself into a stage. Mirrors angled along the walls reflected distorted fragments of the descending figures, multiplying fear in a subtle, almost cruel illusion. Servants and attendants who had been summoned here felt a magnetic dread, a pull towards the unknown that was equal parts fascination and terror. At the bottom, the staircases opened into narrow corridors, the scent of wax and incense thickening with each step. The walls seemed to lean inward, enclosing those who entered in an invisible embrace of control. Faint echoes of the king's voice, long past, could almost be heard, as if the very stone and timber remembered each whispered command, each ritualized movement. It was a place where obedience and fear became inseparable, where the architecture itself enforced submission, preparing anyone who entered for the private ceremonies that awaited beyond the final doors. Even centuries later, historians piecing together the fragments of George S. hidden chambers describe the staircases with an almost reverent fear. They were more than pathways. They were psychological instruments, guiding curiosity and anxiety alike, shaping those who descended into the king's private world. Every step was a test, every creak a warning, and every shadow a reflection of the obsessive mind that constructed this labyrinth. These secret staircases were the arteries of a palace alive not with royalty alone, but with desire, control, and the carefully hidden darkness of a monarch's obsession. Beyond the spiraling staircases lay rooms carefully curated to serve the king's obsessions. Candles burned low, their flames trembling against walls lined with mirrors and dark velvet drapes. The air was heavy, a mixture of incense, wax, and something metallic that hinted at both danger and desire. Every object was deliberate, chains glimmering faintly in the flickering light, masks arranged to conceal identity, and furniture positioned not for comfort, but for control. Each ritual was a performance, a meticulous choreography orchestrated to blur the line between fear, pleasure, and obedience. The king presided over these ceremonies like a conductor, unseen yet omnipresent. Servants, young pages, and courtiers were drawn into his world, each compelled to act, react, and exist within the parameters he established. Their movements were measured, dictated by silent commands and the unyielding weight of the king's gaze. The rituals were never the same twice. Some nights involved elaborate ceremonies of observation, where the mere act of presence became a test of loyalty. Other nights demanded participation in acts of discipline, veiled in the guise of performance and ritual, leaving participants trembling on the knife's edge between fear and fascination. Mirrors multiplied every motion, transforming ordinary gestures into grotesque reflections. Shadows danced across the walls, distorted and exaggerated by candlelight, making every glance feel like exposure. The king watched with meticulous attention, taking note of every faltered step, every quiver of fear, every hesitation. Each ritual was as much psychological as it was physical, a study in dominance, submission, and the vulnerabilities of those who served him. What might seem like indulgence was in truth an exercise of absolute control, a demonstration that power extended beyond decrees, armies, and thrones. Even in the silence between ceremonies, the atmosphere retained its tension. The rooms themselves seemed to hum with memory, echoing with laughter, murmurs, and the faintest cries from nights long past. Servants who later recounted these rituals described the sense of being watched even when no one was present, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the king's compulsions. Every object, every shadow, every whisper contributed to a world governed not by law, but by the obsessive, meticulously controlled desires of a monarch unrestrained by morality. What made the rituals most terrifying and most irresistible was their unpredictability. No participant could ever be sure what would happen next, what would be demanded, or how far the king's imagination would extend. Every ceremony was a blend of spectacle and terror, a private theater of obsession where the king's will was absolute. These rituals were more than indulgence. They were extensions of his mind, an intricate lattice of control, desire, and psychological torment, leaving those who entered irrevocably altered by their passage through his hidden chambers. In the king's hidden world, servants were never mere attendants. They were instruments shaped to fulfill his obsessions. Young pages and chambermaids were drawn into his private ceremonies, their movements measured, their responses meticulously observed. Each gesture, each glance, each subtle shift of posture became part of a silent performance orchestrated by a mind both brilliant and unhinged. Fear intertwined with fascination, leaving participants caught in a tension that seemed to pulse through the very walls. Those chosen to enter the private chambers quickly learned the rules of survival. Obedience above all, discretion above all else. Masks obscured faces, chains and ropes confined bodies, and mirrors reflected distorted images that amplified their terror. Even in moments that seemed intimate or indulgent, the king's control was absolute. Every interaction was a study of compliance, a test of endurance, a subtle exercise in dominance that left no mind untouched. Servants became actors in rituals they could not refuse, their agency subsumed under the careful orchestration of the king's gaze. The psychological weight of these rituals was immense. Participants often described sensations rather than events, the pressure of being observed, the magnetic pull of a presence that dominated both space and thought. Ordinary actions, like standing too straight or glancing too long, could provoke silent reprimand, while the smallest display of obedience might earn an unspoken reward. In this world, power was not wielded openly. It was felt in every heartbeat, every tremor, every instinct honed towards survival and compliance. Yet there was a strange, unnerving allure in the experience. Even as fear coursed through their bodies, participants were drawn deeper into the king's private theater. They witnessed, participated, and absorbed the rhythms of rituals that intertwined desire, control, and terror in ways they could scarcely articulate. Mirrors and shadows distorted the familiar, transforming them into a stage where every action became a reflection of the king's obsession. Over time, the line between participant and instrument blurred, leaving servants enmeshed in a system of control that extended beyond physical constraint into the mind itself. The king's meticulous attention ensured that no one left unchanged. Memories of the chambers lingered long after, haunting footsteps, whispers, and shadows in every corner of the palace. Those who survived the experience carried the invisible mark of their service, an imprint of fear, fascination, and psychological imprinting that mirrored the king's own compulsions. In this hidden world, the servants' bodies and minds were instruments tuned to a single purpose: to serve, to obey, and to exist within the framework of obsession that defined the Mad King's secret dominion. The hidden chambers were alive with reflection and distortion. Mirrors lined the walls at impossible angles, multiplying images, stretching limbs, and twisting faces until the familiar became grotesque. Shadows clung to corners, shifting unnaturally, stretching like silent witnesses to the king's private ceremonies. Every flicker of candlelight became a moving presence, a phantom that watched, and every participant felt the weight of eyes they could neither see nor ignore. In this environment, perception itself became malleable, and reality was measured only by the king's intent. The interplay of mirrors and shadows transformed the chambers into a theater of psychological dominance. Servants and courtiers moved with cautious precision, aware that every motion could be amplified, every hesitation reflected and scrutinized. Chains hanging from the ceiling, masks perched on shelves, and drapes swaying in the candlelight created a surreal stage where human fear and fascination intertwined. The rooms seemed alive, breathing with memories of rituals long past, and echoing with the faint traces of the king's gaze. Participation in these ceremonies required both obedience and surrender. The mirrors forced individuals to confront not only the external arrangement of the space, but the distortion of their own image, magnifying vulnerability and self-consciousness. Shadows multiplied, merging into shapes that suggested hidden presences, figures watching from angles unseen. Participants became both performers and spectators in a reality carefully curated by the king, a world where fear and desire coexisted, inseparable and relentless. Even objects assumed a sentient quality. A mask resting on a table appeared to shift its expression when glanced at from different angles. Chains rattled faintly, as if acknowledging movement. Mirrors caught glimpses of faces that were not entirely their own. In this interplay of reflection and darkness, the king's obsession extended beyond the physical into perception itself. He manipulated not just bodies, but how individuals experienced space, how they processed fear, and how they internalized control. By the time participants left these chambers, they were irrevocably altered. The echoes of shadows and mirrors lingered in memory, a reminder that the king's influence was more than corporeal. It was psychological, pervasive, and enduring. Even centuries later, historians piecing together the fragments of George's secret chambers remark on the meticulous orchestration of light, shadow, and reflection. Every detail was deliberate, designed to evoke awe, fear, and submission, leaving no mind untouched. The hidden chambers, alive with mirrors and shadows, were the king's ultimate instrument, a silent, living testament to the obsessive, controlled darkness at the heart of the Mad King's desires. The first moments inside the hidden chambers were always the most harrowing. Young pages and newly assigned chambermaids were thrust into a world they could scarcely comprehend. Their senses immediately assaulted by the faint metallic tang in the air, the flicker of candlelight across dark walls, and the oppressive weight of unseen eyes. Initiation into the king's private ceremonies was a silent, unspoken test, a trial that measured obedience, courage, and the ability to suppress instinct. Those who faltered were marked, their hesitation remembered long after the ceremony ended. Fear intertwined with fascination. The initiates were drawn deeper into the rituals, compelled to witness, to participate, and to internalize the king's obsession. Every movement was observed, every glance recorded in the hidden ledger of his mind. Masks obscured identity, mirrors multiplied their reflections, and shadows elongated unnaturally, creating a psychological maze in which reality was fragmented. Even as the young servants trembled, there was a strange magnetic allure, a pull toward understanding, toward surviving, and toward becoming part of a system far larger than themselves. The initiates were not merely witnesses, they became instruments. Chains that restrained limbs, ropes that forced posture, and subtle gestures designed to inspire both fear and submission were applied with meticulous precision. Every act, no matter how small, contributed to the king's intricate design. Participation was not optional. Refusal was met with consequences that went beyond physical punishment, isolation, manipulation, or the psychological shadow of unrelenting observation. In this environment, obedience became both armor and prison. Despite the terror, there was a methodical rhythm to the ceremonies that captivated the young attendants. The king's compulsions dictated the flow of each act, blending dominance, control, and ritual in ways that demanded full attention and participation. A quiver of fear could elicit a subtle correction. A careful display of compliance might earn brief respite. Every motion, every reaction was a lesson. An immersion into a world where human instincts were guided, reshaped, and often distorted. By the time the initiates left the chambers, they were changed irrevocably. The memory of chains, masks, mirrors, and shadows lingered like a phantom touch on their psyche. They carried with them the dual imprint of fear and fascination, the invisible mark of a monarch who had blurred the line between ritual and obsession, between punishment and pleasure. In the hidden chambers of King George III, the initiates became living records of his compulsions, proof that no mind, body, or spirit could remain untouched by the Mad King's dark desires. The king's hidden chambers were a place where fear and desire coexisted, intertwined in a dance orchestrated with meticulous cruelty. Punishments were never mere displays of authority. They were lessons, psychological experiments designed to break and reshape those who served him. A trembling chambermaid might be forced to stand for hours beneath the watchful gaze of mirrors that reflected her every tremor, her body an instrument of the king's will. A young page might be guided through rituals that blurred the line between obedience and performance, each act reinforcing his dominance and control. Pleasure, when it appeared, was equally calculated. Moments of reprieve or subtle indulgence were rare, but they were designed to be unforgettable, a reminder that survival required not only fear, but engagement. Servants learned to navigate this delicate balance, understanding instinctively that the king's approval was both coveted and dangerous. One misstep could transform a fleeting gesture of compliance into an act of exposure, punishment, or prolonged observation. Every sensation, whether a fleeting caress of candlelight on skin or the cold weight of chains, was part of a complex system in which mind, body, and environment merged into obedience. The interplay between punishment and pleasure was never predictable. No servant could anticipate when a correction might come, or when a moment of indulgence might briefly lift the oppressive tension. Each ritual was a carefully controlled experiment in human behavior, a study in loyalty and fear. Mirrors multiplied movements, shadows exaggerated every quiver, and the flickering light of candles created an ever-shifting tableau in which even a glance could reveal vulnerability or courage. The king observed silently, noting reactions with a precision that blurred the line between interest, obsession, and calculation. This constant uncertainty left a lingering psychological imprint. Those who survived spoke of a strange fascination, a pull toward the rituals even as they induced terror. Chains and ropes, masks and mirrors became symbols not merely of constraint, but of a world in which control was absolute and instinctive resistance was futile. Over time, the line between punishment and pleasure, coercion and consent blurred into a rhythm dictated entirely by the king's compulsions. Servants became instruments, yes, but they also became unwilling students, learning the dark language of power that governed the hidden chambers. Even after leaving, the memory persisted. The echoes of the king's control, the tension of observed gestures, the faint rustle of drapes and shadows lingered long after the doors were closed. Every servant carried the invisible mark of their participation, a psychological scar woven into the fabric of their memory. The king's obsessions extended far beyond the chambers themselves, shaping the lives of all who served him, leaving a legacy of fear, fascination, and the indelible imprint of his hidden rituals. The Mad King's obsessions were not only enacted in shadows and mirrors, they were meticulously recorded. Hidden ledgers, coded diaries, and secret sketches documented every ritual, every gesture, every participant's reaction. These records were never meant for the eyes of outsiders. They were a private archive of power, obsession, and control, a mirror into the king's mind that was more terrifying than any physical punishment. Each page carried the weight of secrecy, a careful testament to acts that combined desire, fear, and domination into a single, calculated performance. The writing was precise, obsessive, and almost clinical in detail. Observations of servants' posture, tremors, and hesitation were meticulously noted. The king's sketches depicted the placement of furniture, mirrors, and chains, outlining the choreography of rituals that tested loyalty and endurance. Even objects that seemed innocuous were logged with annotations. The angle of a candle, the shimmer of a mask, the curve of a rope. Every detail contributing to the psychological control he exerted over those who entered his hidden chambers. Historians who uncovered fragments of these documents centuries later describe them as both fascinating and horrifying. The king's obsession was apparent not only in the actions he demanded, but in the manner in which he preserved them, as if immortalizing each act of domination was itself a ritual. There was a strange artistry in the records, a dark precision that reflected a mind incapable of separating fascination from control. Each line, each illustration, was evidence of a monarch who regarded obedience as an experiment and human behavior as a subject to be molded. Even in the secrecy of these records, the power dynamics were evident. Notes captured reactions of terror, moments of involuntary pleasure, and instances of compliance or defiance. Mirrors and shadows, chains and masks, All were documented, each item carefully catalogued as part of a living archive of the king's compulsions. The act of recording was itself an extension of ritual, a means of preserving control beyond the physical chambers, allowing the king's influence to extend in time as well as space. The effect on those who glimpsed these records was profound. Diaries and sketches revealed the calculated cruelty behind the king's obsession, the meticulous orchestration of fear and fascination. Even centuries later, the remnants of these documents evoke unease, a sense that the king's gaze, though long gone, still lingers in the margins of the pages. They are a chilling testament to the extent of his control, a permanent imprint of rituals designed to dominate, manipulate, and enthrall all who dared cross the threshold of his hidden chambers. Long after the hidden chambers were locked and the candles extinguished, the echoes of the king's obsessions lingered. Servants carried invisible scars, tremors of memory that returned unbidden, shadows of fear that clung to their steps, and whispers of rituals that haunted even the brightest halls. Their nights were plagued with recollections of chains, masks, and mirrors, each memory a reminder of obedience enforced with subtle cruelty. The trauma was not only physical, but psychological, a lasting imprint of a monarch who merged desire, power, and terror into a single, inescapable reality. Those who had served in the private chambers often found themselves changed in ways that could not be erased. Simple acts, bending to pour tea, lowering a gaze, or adjusting a curtain, brought back a sensation of being observed. Even in the light of day, the world outside the palace seemed governed by the same principles: vigilance, caution, and the constant weight of unseen authority. Memories of the rituals persisted, etched into posture, expressions, and the cadence of speech. Survivors understood, even without speaking it aloud, that their lives had been shaped irreversibly by what they had witnessed, by the meticulous domination of the king's compulsions. The palace itself seemed to retain a memory of the ceremonies. Empty corridors whispered echoes of past actions. Mirrors reflected shadows of movements long vanished, and the faint metallic scent of ritual lingered like a ghost. It was as if the king's obsessions had imprinted themselves not just on minds, but on the very structure of the space, creating an invisible architecture of control that endured long after the king's attention had moved elsewhere. The legacy of fear and fascination became woven into the palace, a silent testament to the obsessive reign of a monarch who wielded private pleasures as instruments of power. Historians attempting to reconstruct these events describe the servants' trauma with a careful detachment, yet even the fragments they uncover hint at profound psychological consequences. So obedience was learned at the cost of innocence, fascination mingled with terror, and the private rituals of the king left invisible marks that extended far beyond the chambers themselves. Each participant became a living reminder of the king's obsessive control, carrying the past into every encounter, every movement, every interaction. And so, the hidden chambers left a legacy of shadows. The servants, forever altered, bore witness to the Mad King's obsessions, their lives intertwined with rituals that combined fear, desire, and domination. The trauma endured, silent, private, and unspoken, a dark reflection of a monarchy where power extended beyond decree and ceremony, seeping into the very souls of those who served. In the echoes of mirrors and shadows, in trembling hands and haunted eyes, the Mad King's compulsions remained immortal, a chilling testament to the hidden world of obsession that ruled beneath the gilded surface of empire. Even behind the palace walls, secrets have a way of surfacing. Whispers of the king's strange rituals and obsessions slithered through the corridors of power, carried in hushed tones by courtiers and servants alike. The rumors were never spoken openly, but they traveled nonetheless, shadowing the polished grandeur of the court. A glance too long, a gesture misinterpreted, or the faintest tremor in a servant's step could ignite speculation, hinting at a darkness lurking behind the crown. Those close to the king learned quickly that curiosity was dangerous, yet fascination persisted. Nobles and advisors observed subtle signs: an unusual arrangement of mirrors, a fleeting candlelit reflection in the king's private chambers, a sudden disappearance of a page or maid, and began piecing together the puzzle of his compulsions. Every observation was speculative, each rumor laden with fear and morbid intrigue. The court became a web of conjecture, where loyalty and dread intertwined, and where the hidden life of the king shaped the whispers that would eventually reach history. The secrecy of the rituals lent them power. Rumors were more potent than facts. Imagination filled in the gaps left by the king's careful concealment. Some spoke of masks and mirrors that reflected not only physical form, but moral decay. Others hinted at ceremonies that tested obedience to extremes, blending terror with fascination. Each story, whether exaggerated or fragmentary, served as a lens into a world meticulously constructed to dominate, manipulate, and enthrall. Even the courtiers who never entered the hidden chambers felt the presence of obsession, an intangible force that hovered in the air, shaping the behavior of all who lived within the palace walls. Public perception remained largely untouched, yet the undercurrent of rumor subtly influenced decisions, alliances, and reputations. Nobles who misjudged the king's private compulsions found themselves marginalized, their loyalty questioned, or their positions quietly diminished. The fear of exposure extended beyond the chambers themselves, seeping into the political and social fabric of the monarchy. Observers came to understand that the king's obsessions were more than private indulgence. They were instruments of power that reached far beyond the hidden chambers, touching every corner of courtly life. In these whispered tales, the first hints of the king's legacy emerged. What had begun as private compulsions slowly became a narrative of fascination and fear, a story passed in secrecy from one generation of courtiers to the next. And though the public remained largely ignorant, the seeds of scandal had been planted. In the quiet corners of the court, the shadows of mirrors and the weight of observation created a tense undercurrent, a sense that the king, Eats Ahat's private world, was closer to revelation than anyone dared admit, a darkness that would eventually leave its mark on history. Centuries after the flickering candles had burned out, fragments of the king's private diaries surfaced, hidden among estate papers and forgotten trunks. Each page revealed glimpses of a mind consumed by obsession, a monarch whose compulsions had shaped not only the chambers and rituals, but the lives of all who served him. The diaries were meticulous in detail, chronicling actions, reactions, and the subtle intricacies of control. They transformed rumor into undeniable evidence, exposing the darkness long whispered about in secret corridors. Historians handling these papers described a chilling precision. The king documented not only the rituals themselves, but the psychological states of his participants, their fear, fascination, and unspoken resistance. Sketches illustrated mirrors, chains, and arrangements of furniture, each annotated with careful notes on how the spaces manipulated perception and behavior. Pages contained coded references, revealing ceremonies designed to test obedience, endurance, and compliance. These were not idle indulgences. They were calculated studies of human behavior, exercises in dominance preserved for posterity. The leaked diaries were met with disbelief, fascination, and horror in equal measure. Scholars, initially skeptical of courtly rumors, were forced to confront the reality of the king's compulsions. The documents portrayed a ruler whose obsession extended beyond private indulgence, a monarch who wielded fear, desire, and meticulous observation as instruments of power. Each entry was a psychological experiment, a blueprint of domination that allowed him to manipulate not only bodies, but minds, leaving an invisible imprint on the palace and all who dwelled within. Even beyond the palace walls, the diaries changed perception. Accounts of rituals, hidden chambers, and servant compliance began to surface in scholarly works and whispered tales. The public, once unaware of the darkness lurking behind gilded doors, gradually glimpsed the contours of obsession that had governed private life. The king's compulsions, once secret and absolute, were now mapped in ink and paper, their traces preserved as evidence of a monarchy where the most intimate acts had been instruments of control and terror. These diaries revealed the full scale of the hidden world, the meticulous choreography of mirrors and shadows, the psychological manipulation of initiates, and the perverse rhythm of punishment and pleasure. They transformed whispers into history, turning fear and fascination into knowledge. For the first time, the private obsessions of the Mad King were exposed in their entirety, leaving historians, descendants, and the wider world to grapple with the chilling truth. That obsession, carefully concealed for decades, had endured, recorded with clinical precision, and left a legacy of fear, fascination, and irrevocable psychological imprint. The moment the king's private world was hinted at in public discourse, the palace trembled. Courtiers, once silent in fear or fascination, could no longer contain their whispers. Fragments of diaries, leaks of rituals, and rumors that had lingered in shadow were now discussed openly, cautiously at first, and then with growing audacity. What had been a secret labyrinth of mirrors, chains, and obsession became a subject of scandal, casting a shadow over the monarchy itself. Newspapers and pamphlets, fueled by intrigue and outrage, spread stories of the hidden chambers. Illustrations, exaggerations, and eyewitness accounts painted a picture so grotesque that the public could scarcely believe it. Mirrors that multiplied terror, servants forced into obedience, and rituals blending fear and desire became fodder for a growing narrative of depravity. The Mad King's compulsions, once confined to whispered corridors and secret staircases, now permeated the consciousness of a kingdom eager to understand the darkness behind the crown. The scandal did more than provoke curiosity. It reshaped perception of the monarchy. Nobles and advisors, long complicit or silent, faced scrutiny. Loyalty was questioned, alliances shifted, and reputations were permanently altered. The king, though removed from public view in his private chambers, became a figure both feared and grotesquely fascinated over, his hidden compulsions now a lens through which all of his actions were interpreted. Every decree, every gesture, every public appearance was measured against the shadowed world of obsession that the diaries had revealed. Even historians struggled to contain the horror of the revelations. The intricacies of control, the psychological manipulation of servants, and the meticulous recording of acts previously hidden from the world forced a re-evaluation of the monarch's reign. What had once been dismissed as eccentricity or rumor was now undeniable. A ruler whose obsessions extended far beyond personal indulgence into the very fabric of courtly life, shaping behavior, instilling fear, and leaving an invisible mark on the palace itself. And yet, there remained fascination. The public's horror was inseparable from curiosity, a morbid desire to understand the rituals that had been so carefully concealed. Scholars, journalists, and storytellers pieced together fragments of diaries, sketches, and accounts, constructing a vision of a palace where power, obsession, and desire coexisted in meticulous, terrifying harmony. The Mad King, long hidden behind gilded walls and whispered corridors, had left a legacy that could no longer be ignored. His compulsions were revealed not just as private indulgence, but as a force that had shaped the palace, the court, and the history of a nation. Long after the candles had burned out and the hidden chambers were abandoned, the shadow of the Mad King lingered. His obsessions, once secret and meticulously orchestrated, had seeped into history, leaving traces that could not be erased. Scholars, historians, and descendants of the court carried fragments of his rituals, the echo of mirrors and chains, and the whispered accounts of servants who had lived under the weight of his compulsions. The palace itself seemed to hold a memory, a lingering presence of dominance and obsession that refused to vanish. The legacy was not merely one of fear, it was also a testament to the meticulous mind that had orchestrated it. Every mirror, every shadow, every recorded ritual revealed a monarch who transformed private indulgence into instruments of control. His compulsions were an extension of authority, blending psychological manipulation with fascination, and leaving an indelible mark on those who survived. The hidden chambers, once the realm of whispers and terror, became a symbol of the intertwining of power, obsession, and secrecy that defined his reign. Public fascination has endured centuries later. The king's diaries, sketches, and accounts continue to captivate, horrify, and mystify. Historians reconstruct his world with careful attention to detail, uncovering rituals that once existed beyond the comprehension of ordinary observers. The chambers, the mirrors, the servant's obedience, the interplay of fear and fascination. All are now part of the narrative of a ruler who wielded obsession as deftly as a scepter, controlling not only the bodies, but the minds of his court. Yet, for all the horror, there is a dark allure. The king's compulsions were an intimate theater of power, a private world that demanded attention, respect, and fear. They serve as a reminder of the human capacity for obsession, the thin line between authority and cruelty, and the ways in which secrecy can amplify both fascination and terror. Through hidden staircases, mirrored corridors, and meticulously documented rituals, the Mad King left a legacy that endures not only in history books, but in the imagination. A chilling testament to the depths of desire and control. Ultimately, the Mad King's obsessions remind us that history is not only shaped by wars and politics, but by the private worlds of those in power. His rituals, his mirrors, his chains, and his diaries are monuments to the extremes of human compulsion, hidden from public view, yet capable of reaching across time. They endure as a shadowed echo of a monarchy where fear and fascination were inseparable, and where the private desires of a single man left an imprint that centuries could not erase. In the corridors of history, the Mad King's obsessions remain alive, dark, meticulous, and unforgettable.